my last video, I mentioned that the minor third makes up one half of the major minor tonal system that has dominated Western music for the last 400 years. So this time round, it seems only fair that we look at the other side of the coin, which of course is the major third. The major third gets its name from being 4 semitones away from the root, as opposed to the minor third, which is only 3 semitones away from the root. This perhaps goes some way to explaining why the minor third is considered a sad or darker interval, whereas the major third is considered a bright and happy interval. And it's purely because the closer a note gets to the root, the more dissonant and more dark it's going to sound. The major third is often associated with joyful or happy music. This is not always the case. If you consider something like Tears in Heaven, for instance, that's a piece that uses the major scale or is in the major key. It's not always the case that something in a major key is always a happy piece of music. But however, for the purposes of ear training, we're going to stick to the happier sounding melodies. Of course, the purposes of ear training are really to be able to identify intervals and identify chord changes when you hear them being played, which allows you to either jam with other people in that respect or work things out by ear. It also helps with sight reading, with improvising, and also with writing your own melodies, your own tunes, or your own bass lines. Good ear training is one of those helpful tools in the musician's toolbox that will help you progress at a faster rate. Not only that, it will eventually get to the point where when you hear something in your head or being played outside your head, as it were, you'll be able to play it straight back. And again, this is a very helpful tool when it comes to jamming with other people or working things out by ear or improvising. When it comes to associating an interval with a melody, now that we're looking at the major third, there are several tunes that come to mind. Also quite happy ones as well. This is probably case in point. Which of course is Happy Days Are Here Again, and you probably can't get much more happy than that. When it comes to the major third, this is one of the favourite tunes to associate with the major third. Which is of course Oh When the Saints, another happy tune for you. That is of course Obla-Di Obla-Da by the Beatles. Another good example would be this. Which is Jerusalem by Parry, often considered to be Britain's second national anthem. Another good example would be this one. Which is Morning Has Broken by Cat Stevens. Also, notice how all of these tunes so far have used the major triad as a structural part of the melody. Perhaps the odd one out there being Oh When the Saints, that used the 4th degree of the scale in that. But again, similar structures. So far, these have been ascending major thirds, so let's have a look at some tunes that use descending major thirds. Here's a good example. This is the motive from Beethoven's 5th Symphony. Descending major third. Descending minor third. Amazing to think that he built a whole symphony just on those intervals. Also interesting is when it comes to the 4th movement of that piece, he flips the whole thing on its head and starts that whole movement with a major pattern like this. There's that major triad again. Very common pattern in so many melodies. Another good descending melody to really get the sound of major thirds in your memory would be this one. that is Giant Steps by John Coltrane. But I think one of my favourite examples of a melody that uses a descending and ascending major third would be Summertime by George Gershwin. This particular melody came from Gershwin's opera, which was Porgy and Bess, written in 1934 and performed in 1935. So let's have a closer listen to this melody. It's an interesting fact that this particular melody is in the Guinness Book of Records as being the most recorded song in history. 67,000 plus recordings of this song by thousands of different artists, each one of those being different. Now it does make you wonder, what is it about this melody that makes it so popular and makes it such a good melody? Perhaps part of the answer lies in its simplicity. Really, the melody itself is just a pentatonic shape, as it were. That perhaps allows for a blank canvas for different kinds of harmonization underneath that melody. And indeed, there are many different examples of that. One good video to watch would be on the channel Jazz Duets with Nick Holmes, who goes through 25 different ways of harmonizing this song. And there are more besides, so that's well worth a watch, and the link is below. Let's have a closer look at this melody and see if we can find some of the ingredients that actually make this a good melody. If you remember from the last video, I showed a list of 10 points that go into making up the ingredients of a good melody. See below. From that list, we'll see how many boxes we can tick off. One of the important things to notice about this song or about this melody is the fact that it is actually a lullaby. We're introduced to this song at the beginning of the opera Porgy and Bess when the character Clara sings this to her baby in an attempt to get the baby off to sleep. There are many aspects of this tune that really lend itself to being called a lullaby. One of them is the swaying, rocking motion of the initial two notes that give us our major third at the beginning. Other aspects are within the structure itself. The structure, by the way, is A, B, A, C. Within the A, B sections, we have a call and response pattern. It's this kind of alternating, swaying, rocking pattern that is quite pervasive throughout the tune. Also, within the A and the B sections, especially the A section, Gershwin has the chords going from chord 1 to chord 2. Again, sort of swaying, rocking motion of the chords over the melody. It's also interesting to compare this to other lullabies that use this kind of rocking, swaying motion within the intervals and the rhythm. A good example would be the Sky Boat song. Another example would be Brahms' Lullaby. And another good example would be Hush Little Baby. So we can see that most of these melodies have this kind of swaying, rocking, alternating feel between the intervals. There's another box ticked. The tune starts with a descending and ascending major third. So we can think of that as a call phrase or a question phrase that is followed by a response phrase or an answering phrase. So this major third is followed by an eighth note pattern. And that eighth note pattern is descending and ascending, but it's been sort of squashed, as it were, into a major second. Also, the change in rhythm that we have here, we've gone from a quarter note to a group of 4 eighth notes. And this is known as diminution. It's a compositional device or compositional technique that takes a phrase of a certain rhythm and then halves the value of that rhythm. And again, this is a developmental tool, offering a bit of contrast and variation. And if we follow this through, the call and response patterns between A section, the B section, then the A section, and finally the C section, and we cut out all the long or held or tied notes within this piece, we end up with a pattern like this. So we have a descending pattern that's running through the whole melody. It's quite an interesting contour because it's kind of rising and falling, and again demonstrating this kind of swaying, rocking motion that is consistent with lullabies. It's also interesting to note that the longer extended notes in the A section also form some interesting patterns. First of all, we have the A section. Scale degree 5, going to scale degree 1, going back to scale degree 5, with that lovely slide in the middle of that on the words easy. In the B section, we have again a descending minor third pattern. These are on scale degrees 4 and scale degrees 2. Now you would normally consider these to be dissonant intervals, but in this case, scale degree 4 lines up with chord 4 and scale degree 2 ends up with chord 5. Fisher jumping, chord 4, and the chord is high, chord 5. Then we get a repeat of the A section, which is pretty much the same with a slight change in rhythm. And then we come to the C section. Now, at this particular point, the descending, ascending major third pattern has been inverted into a rising and falling minor third pattern. Interestingly, the harmony at this particular point has gone to the relative major, chord 3, which of course is C major. Back to chord 5 and eventually landing on chord 1. Also interesting to note is the descent at that point, so hush little baby, don't you cry, which is almost like a major 3-2-1 cadential descending pattern that you see in a lot of pieces. It's always a favourite of Schenker analysis to point that one out. He tends to turn a lot of pieces into 3 blind mice. But in this case, it's more like a minor cadential finishing pattern. It's interesting to note that the harmony in the original Gershwin piece is fairly straightforward, although the orchestration underneath some of the chordal movements is quite complex. For instance, the bass line that I was using for the melody when I played it was the Stan Getz bass line, which uses a lot of chromatic descents. It uses a lot of rising fourth progressions as well, sort of cycle of fourth descent type thing. As I've said, this really does leave the door open to different harmonic interpretations of this melody, because after all, start from one note, which is the second degree of the scale there. The whole tune is purely just a pentatonic pattern, hinting at the blues because of the 1/4 progression, but it's a 16-bar structure, so it's not quite the blues, and especially when we get chord 3 at the very end, which really gives it that feel of a lullaby. A very interesting piece indeed. Some interesting compositional devices contained within this piece. I think it definitely ticked a few of our 10-point ingredients of making a good melody. So I do hope this has been of use to you and you found it interesting. If so, please hit the like button. Don't forget there's Patreon, which will give you 25% discount on all one-to-one bass lessons whenever you sign up for that. When it comes to bass lessons, if you want to get in touch with me and arrange a bass lesson, first lesson is also free. So feel free to reach out and get in touch. I'll be glad to talk to you and help you out in whatever way that you see fit. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. We'll be looking at more melodies of this kind next time. My name's Pete. This is The Infinite Bass. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.